So, good morning, members of the Tikkun Elevator Kollel. Today I got my construction shirt on because we're going to be building some facts about our past. I've been wanting to really get into the subject of the life of the Ari, and I want to talk about something about the life and the times of the Ari. It's a little bit mysterious exactly who he is and where he came from, but let's talk about a little bit about the situation that existed in the environment and the history of the situation that brought the Jews to Tzfat, and something a little bit maybe about the background of the Ari. I remember reading once the great rabbi by the name of the Rosh, who had escaped Germany, and he came to Spain before the expulsion. It was even in the cards. And he was a tremendous scholar, Ashkenazi scholar, and he tried throughout his lifetime that he lived in Spain trying to convert the Sephardim to the Ashkenaz way of thinking as a way that he understood that people should behave. It was a completely different society. And so, although he was tremendously successful in his own limud and those of his sons and those who followed after him, but the Spanish society remained a closed book to him. He couldn't quite figure it out. So we want to talk about, since this is the milieu that we're talking about coming eventually, ripening in Sfat that brought the Ari there, I want to tell something about the Ari's story. We have to understand a little bit about what was actually going on in Spain. The Jews had been living in Spain for 1,500 years. They were extremely established in a country that was feudal. Now, what do I mean by feudal? It means it's not like the United States. If I come in here as a pauper, in one generation I become a billionaire. It's possible in this country. But in Spain, it wasn't like that. It wasn't like that anywhere in Europe at that time. That whatever level of society you were born into, well, that's this level that you maintain. Well, the Jews had attained a certain level of standing in the Spanish society. 1,500 years is a long time. They owned houses, they owned mansions, they owned olive groves, they owned vineyards. They were one of the main professions of Jews was something that they called tax farming. Tax farming was, for example, if the crown would needed $50 million in order to run the government, so the Jews, or a group of Jews, would buy up the $50 million, and then they would collect taxes from people. Maybe they'd make $10 million on the deal. They did this generation after generation, and they were the main contributors of the financial wealth of the Spanish Empire because they kept it going. They were people they could trust. So that was a situation. That's how entrenched that the Jews were, because these families were very, very interconnected. The family was very important, and they were very strong in that sense. A civil war began as Christianity started to spread from the northern part of Spain to the southern part of Spain. And as the Christians became more and more successful, they came in contact with large numbers of Jews. Now, what to do with them? Because the Christians were really fanatics, and they believed that the Jews were the enemies of God, and as a result of that, they had to do something about it. And pogroms would break out in the more northern areas, and there had been a history of the Almohads being in previous generations of Jews being forced to convert to Islam, and then it would back off and they come back and be over Jews. Well, they thought maybe what would happen over here in Spain was that the Christians would come in, there were pogroms, and Jews would be forced to convert to Christianity. So then they would figure, well, maybe we'll be able to get back. And so they continued to practice Judaism in secret. And this is part of the idea of the crypto Jew, the Jew who's really Jewish, but he has to act like he's a Christian sometimes. So this continued as the Empire of the North began to get stronger and stronger and beat back the Muslims. So anyone that was under their grasp had to convert or else suffer tremendous consequences. Some people didn't convert, but many did. And in looking at my own family background, I looked at a place in Spain, with the northern part of Spain. In 1391, there were 20,000 Jews that were reported in a census there. It's a town which today is called Huete, but in those days was called Gueta. And there are Spanish Jews that have that last name. At any rate, In 1391, there were 20,000 Jews. In 1392, there were none. All of them were forcibly converted. This is a very typical thing that started happening in Spain. It didn't happen over all at once. It happened little by little. And the point is that you could be punished in many different ways, including death at the hands of pogroms and so on and so forth, or you could try to pretend and get your way along. But the people who pretended were the ones that became subject to the Inquisition. The Inquisition was already established, and what it meant was there were lapsed heretics, and that's what happened in a very sad part of Spain. And as time went on, and during the reign of Fernando and Isabella, the Spanish, the Castellanos, the people from the north, came and conquered the entire Spain. And the Jews were given an expulsion order. Expulsion order was put off from 1392 and all the way through until 1492, when they were forced to either convert or leave. Of course, when you are under those circumstances, if you own a vineyard, if you own a mansion, nobody would buy it. So, you were at the mercy, and you would change, as he says in this book, and I want to show you a book, which is called The Sephardic Legacy. There's a lot about Spanish Jews or Sephardic Jews that they just don't know about what actually happened, because once you were out of Spain, there was no more talking about what went on in Spain. It was a whole different story. And I want to just try to read a little bit from this book to give you a favor. So, the edict was really pronounced in 1392, but they postponed it for 100 years. Then, so let's give an example here of what it was like in Spain right before the expulsion. It says a telling indication of the prevailing atmosphere in the legend of Torquemada, who many say was actually converso, or came from conversos, who got wind of the fact that the Jews were trying to offer Fernando, that is the king of Spain, 30,000 dinar in exchange for the order's revocation. So again, there is rumors that Fernando was also descended from conversos, but he was of royal blood and he was the king. His wife, on the other hand, Isabella, was a fanatic anti-Semite. So that Torquemada came on hearing that the Jews were trying to pay off for 30,000 dinar, which apparently is a tremendous amount of money, maybe $1 billion, I don't know. On hearing of this, he entered the tent in which negotiations were taking place. He laid a crucifix on the table and declared that in the past Jews had sold their Lord for 30 pieces of silver. Now the king of Spain was about to sell him again for 30,000 gold dinars. At that point, the negotiations about what were going to happen to the Jews were suspended and canceled. So the edict of expulsion was blamed on the Jews. Expulsion at their own doorstep and explicitly prohibited their return. Anyone who did not convert, become a Catholic, would be not allowed to return. So the king and the queen both signed this, and that is the beginning of a terrible tragedy that took place. Listen to this. One of the most shocking events connected with the expulsion of the conversion of Abraham Senior and most of his family. Now, he was like the grand money man for the king. As this took place on 15th of June, 1492, and the Jews were expelled in August. So he tried very hard to avoid this. So he was converted in the Church of Guadalupe, one of the Catholic monarch's favorite pilgrimage sites. He was baptized Fernan Núñez Coronel. His son-in-law, his name was Mayor Melamed, who converted at the same time. These extremely wealthy and influential Jews. He also converted at the same time and assumed the name of Fernan Perez Coronel. This happened everywhere. And when the Jews, the time actual came, let me see if we got a date on this. I don't think I do here. Skipping around a little bit. Get a little bit more. When the actual time that came, the leave came, and obviously it was a tremendous amount of Jews. Some estimate there were 200,000 Jews that left, 200,000 Jews that didn't, that stayed in Spain. And they became conversos. The day of the expulsion was the same day that Christopher Columbus, who was a converso, and his crew, who were all conversos, left and eventually found Cuba, which is a whole other story. The majority of Jews left Spain and went to Portugal. But there was a lot of pressure, just like you see, like with today, we have the Syrian refugees. So they crowd in, there's jillions of them. The Jews had to leave with basically the clothes on their back, or if they had time to prepare, or they were wealthy enough, they had something waiting for them when they got there, but there were refugee camps in Portugal. You know that Portugal is a country which basically is mountainous. It has a border with Spain on the east and on the north, and the rest of it is really a seacoast. So if you're going to leave Portugal, you're going to have to leave by the sea. Some of the ugliness, some of the pure tragedy of what happened here. What to do with all these refugees? It became a tremendous sociological problem. So the Portuguese, the crown, with the idea in mind of what they're ultimately going to do, convinced the Jews that they would be resettled in other places, in Portuguese colonies around the world, and they brought them down to the docks, and under most horrifying circumstances. First, they had an edict against all of the children. First it was 14 years old and under had to come. Then 20, then expanded to 20 years. They all came down to the docks, many, of course, with their families and their parents. And they forcibly converted them all en masse. So now all the Jews, some escaped, some did not convert. It's a very small number. Suddenly became Christians, subject to an inquisition that was already planned that was going to take place a few years later. So now you get the idea, first of all, if you ever heard of the Spanish Portuguese synagogue, they have one in New York, they have one in Amsterdam. So you understand this, it's not that it's a mixture, it's just that the Spanish came into Portugal and they were stuck there and forcibly converted. Many of them made their way out. This is how Jews got to Hamburg, Jews got to Lithuania, because it was far away from the church. The church at that time was a monster with tentacles every place that you could imagine. There's a little story that I heard about that I want to tell. But first, let's say that a lot of people also went across the Turks invited the Jews to come. They realized the value that they could have. They were Muslims, and the Jews had done great things with Muslims in Spain. The Turks ruled most of the Mediterranean, the Balkans, Turkey itself, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, all across the North Africa was controlled by the Ottomans. And Jews were forced to leave on the same day. Everybody had to get out. They had a very small opening to be able to get out, and the ports were jammed. It was hard for Columbus to get out, stay for the new year. It's really very, very interesting. And on the ships were attacked by pirates. The ships were a tremendous amount of disease because there's no food. People died on those ships. People were enslaved in those ships. But some made it, of course, to the other side. Now, this is all about the time that precedes the advent of the Uri. Because the Uri was born 30 years later, let's say approximately, and we'll get you the date a little bit later on. But the story is, here's a little story that it's funny that was a series of tapes called Hasidic Tales of Inspiration that I used to listen to when I'd say these stories to my kids. And now my kids want to say them to my grandkids. At any rate, it's a story goes like this. It says that once upon a time, and now what I was going to say was is that the amazing thing is I live here in Miami and Miami Beach, and Miami Beach is surrounded by what I would call northern Cuba because there's a tremendous number of Cubans here. And if you had relationships with Cubans that speak Spanish, so I was able to do a lot of business with Cubans. You see, there's a tremendous regard, tremendous love and regard for Jews. It's very unusual because, there's been an inquisition in the Catholic world that somehow missed them. And that's because many of them, in fact, are conversos, which is a tremendous tragedy. Flags, Israeli flags in their houses, all different kinds of ornaments that they get from I don't know where that are Jewish. Or they don't know too much about Judaism, and you have people wanting to come back, and in fact, they do. Amongst Cubans, there are a lot of them that want to try to come back. It's not so easy for them. At any rate, here's a story that I had learned. I told to my kids, and I was out with a competitor. So we were salesmen. So there was no great love lost between the two of us. We were hanging around because we were waiting for the sales opportunity to come up. He starts telling me this story that he said his boss told him. So it says this following story. This is a story that I had told previously to my children. It's only about Jewish people. He says there was a family, who somehow made their way across the Mediterranean, and they were absolutely destitute. They were living in Egypt. They managed to get to Egypt. And came Pesach time, and they had just a few pennies to be able to try to buy matzah and fish. You're in a foreign country. You're in a place where you don't know the language. Everything is terrible. So the wife gives the husband, they go over their money, they have almost nothing, they count it out, and she says, just let's get some matzah and get a little bit of fish or anything you can who can make a Pesach. So as he's on his way to try to find the matzah, he goes by the slave market, and there he sees that there's a little girl, Jewish girl, being sold. She's 3, 4 years old. She's being sold as a slave. Her parents are gone. She's sold by herself. And nobody wants to buy her because she's a little kid who wants this, what could she do for a family? So he has tremendous rachmanis for her. He starts to cry a little bit, and he has, what could he do? He has this little bit of money, so he takes this little bit of money, and sure enough, he buys the little girl. Now he takes her back home. He has no fish, no matzah. Instead, he's got another mouth to feed. Well, his wife looks at this, and she's beside herself because she knows she can't make a Pesach this way. Everybody, on the one hand, is tremendous joy that they had this little girl that came out of Spain, and she was taken by our cousins as pirates and captured and now sold in the slave market, and he bought her. And everybody's mishtumin. They're all completely, don't know what to say or what to do. And he realizes that their Pesach is going to be different, but a failure also. The matzah goes outside, and he's just sitting there. And the man says to him, he says, hey, look, can you do me a favor? He says, okay. No, this is not the problem. He says, I want you to hold something here. And he gives him this, and he says, here's a few dollars. He has to give him some money. He says, there's going to be some guys come by, and these are Jewish people he's talking about, and I want you to give it to them. So when they come, make sure that they get this package. So he stays there. He has money now. A little bit, not a lot. And the men come by, and they thank him. They give him some more money. And then one thing leads to another, and he becomes known as what they call in Jewish an ish ne'eman, a person that you could trust. This is that you give him something, he'll hold it for you. He'll take care of you. Ask him to do this, and they asked him. This group of people started asking for errands. Apparently they had money. One thing led to another, and before long he became famous or less well known, and he started making money and money and money, and he became a tremendously, tremendously rich person. Now, this is a story that takes place. It's called The True Friend. It's the first part of a story that's over there in Hasidic Tales of Inspiration about what it means to have a true friend. And it's about these Jews who had settled in North Africa, And somehow, one way or another, God blessed them and they started to get stronger. That's a story there. Now, somehow you have to get over to Tzfat because Tzfat is where the Ari lived. And we'll take that up later. We have just a little flavor of the background in Spain, what happened to so many Jews who wound up staying behind, later tried to get out. There were many different places. They used to have a statement that if you were living in Portugal, you could get to Amsterdam, which was a free city, was absolutely anti-Catholic. Then you had a chance, but it was a small place. It was a place of confluence of Ashkenaz and Sephardi Jews. And if you had a little bit of money, you needed to get out of there because it was small. You could go to another free city, which was Hamburg. And there you see the start of the Sephardi influence that was in the German community. But the tentacles of the church were everywhere looking for Jews who had escaped Portugal and Spain. And as a result, many people went to Lithuania, which was all part of a greater country called, well, let's say an area called Poland at that time. Because in Lithuania, the people were just getting out of Avodah Zarah. They were just getting out of fairy worship and just becoming Catholics. And the church was very weak in that place. And that has a little bit of a background, according to Barrel of Wine and other sources, of how the Lithuanian Jews were so important in scholarly circles. Actually had a background in Spain. So that's a little story about that. Next time we're going to actually take up, now we have a little background about the difficulty and the actual, really the horrors of what it is to be a refugee and taking away from, imagine that you had a wealthy life in Spain and now taking such a tremendous fall. And we'll try to get around then again to a little bit more later on about the Ari and the development of who he was as a person beyond our realm, but as Rabbi Memran says, things are opening up again. Okay, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed. That's the main thing, is to enjoy.